I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Not Quite Religious, a podcast where a Christian pastor and former evangelical turned atheist have conversations about faith, religion, philosophy, and life while drinking coffee.
Welcome to episode 13, where we talk about fairies, delusions, reality, and the morals of trying to lift the veils off of people's faces, not in the wedding sense. Do you want to start?
Fairies is in winged mythical creatures.
Typically associated with Ireland, I think, right?
Oh, I don't know.
Irish Celtic. I think they're Celtic in origin, although they had like that giant resurgence in the 1880s in the United States.
Every time somebody comments on, not every time, but a lot of times people, when they comment to me about this podcast in person, will mention that they learned stuff from Nate. And that has proven true once again. I'll have to look up. I'll have to fact check it. But fairies, yeah, it does seem like a very Celtic.
Yeah, and I think it used to be spelled like Faere, silent G-H.
Yeah.
O-U.
You can just hear like a Celtic person
Right.
saying it.
Right.
Like,
Fairy.
yeah, exactly. Fatty, yeah.
It's more Scottish.
I don't know.
I'm Irish by heritage, and I have a terrible Irish accent.
Yeah.
But my Scottish is pretty good from watching Braveheart.
Nice. I'm not even gonna attempt any accents from anywhere. I grew up in northern Ohio. If you go south of Columbus, you get a bit of an Appalachian drawl, but I grew up in that part of northern Ohio, northern Indiana, Great Lakes region where, outside of, there's some accents out there, but I grew up in that part of the country that's like, this is how you should talk if you're going to be a newscaster.
Yeah.
Like I think it's just called like the American accent.
Yeah.
It's like generic.
Yeah, it's like what Tom Holland learned to be Spider-Man.
Right. So,
which is funny because he's playing a New Yorker. But
right. Didn't he have sort of like a Queens thing going on?
I guess a little bit. Not what I typically associate with New York.
I guess so.
You know.
We could do this all day. This could be the podcast, just like me inciting you to do various accents.
Right.
But fairies. Well, what I wanted to bring up was fairies is sort of like a metaphor here for anything sort of supernatural, anything mythical. And we were talking, Nate, before about off the air. We were talking about if you meet somebody who believes in fairies, I suppose, like in my neck of the woods in Brattleboro, you might meet a person here or there who genuinely believes in fairies. But
yeah, I think there's quite a few people that legit believe in fairies, or we could say Bigfoot, or
right,
Chupacabra.
Yeah, but what we were talking about was the morality of trying to uncover the veil of delusion.
Right, dissuade
people, like the morality of that, and relating that to our conversations about atheism versus Christianity, and I was trying to make the point that people are willfully deluded, and you said that you disagreed with that, and that what I heard from you was this. There's sort of this it's morally incumbent upon those of us who know something is false, or who believe something is false, to try and dissuade a person who disagrees out of their delusion, out of their falsehood, which is also implying that believing something that's not true is harmful. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, so I think my position is actually, I don't know if it's morally incumbent upon someone who doesn't believe in fairies to convince people who believe in fairies that they're not real.
Interesting.
In certain circumstances. So in our last episode, we talked about, the heroin addict who finds Jesus, or a church, or however you want to describe what they did, and they get sober and they become a great husband and a great dad, and they live a great life, where before they were under a bridge shooting up heroin all day, potentially going to die really soon with a very poor quality of life. Sort of to take it away from Christianity, like if that guy or gal got sober because of their belief in fairies, and they're a better person because they believe in fairies, is it morally okay if fairies don't exist to convince them that they don't exist, or will that, make them relapse to the point where there is no hope? And I think it's a complicated, interesting question because, as an empiricist and a materialist and an atheist, I view most beliefs in the supernatural as detrimental and harmful. And so I think there is a moral component to being an evangelist, so to speak, for atheism. But if it causes someone more harm, like, should I just leave it be?
I'm interested in what you think about the comment that I made, which is, I feel like I don't think it's an empirical fact, but it's an empirical comment, and it's simply just a practical observation from my own experience, which is that people are willfully deluded a lot of times, and somebody who is willfully deluded can't be persuaded. Only people who are open can be persuaded. And so I asked the question about ethics in terms of like time spent and energy spent. Is it casting your pearls before swine, so to speak? Are you wasting your time trying to dissuade somebody from believing in fairies who is never, ever, ever going to? Should you maybe, in your evangelistic efforts, look for people who are open and spend your time there?
Yeah. So I guess I have two responses to that. First, with the willfully deluded. Actually, let me answer that second. So should you go for the low-hanging fruit first? When I left the faith, I was very, very vocal about it on Facebook, to the point of purposely kicking hornets' nests, knowing I was going to kick it, and having 600 comment threads of evangelicals versus me, essentially. And what I realized very, very soon, or very, very quickly into it, is I wasn't convincing any diehard evangelical that I was engaging one-on-one with, right? So if I would post something and an evangelical would fire back with an apologetic answer or something, and I would fire back to them. So it was Nate versus Guy A going back and forth. Guy A was getting more entrenched, right? Not the Dunder Kruger effect, but what is it where you, the more you're pushed into not believe them,
I don't know what it's called, but I know the phenomenon you.
Yeah. So when you show people evidence that's contradictory to their beliefs, oftentimes it actually doubles down on their belief, and right. So I knew that when I was engaging person A on Facebook, they weren't going to deconvert. But what I found out was people watching the volley, all of a sudden could get dissuaded from some of these beliefs because of how people were interacting. And so through that, I had people who were I'm not leaving Christianity, but that circle that I was a part of, I want nothing to do with anymore.
So you brought up an interesting context. You put my question in the context of, you took it out of one-on-ones, which is the way I was thinking about it. I didn't put it in that context.
Yeah.
But that's the way I was thinking of it, was in one-on-ones. And you put it in the context of a Facebook thread, which is interesting, because I think similar things too, and people who know me know that I quite enjoy interacting on Facebook and getting into conversations and dialogues and debates with people. But I think some people misunderstand. They're like, you're wasting your time with that person. I'm like, I would be wasting my time over coffee with that person.
Right.
But I'm not wasting my time because there are people listening.
Yes. And
benefiting, I think.
Right.
Otherwise, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
I don't want to waste my time.
Right.
So those are different contexts.
Yeah. So initially, when I was trying to deconvert people, I realized very quickly it wasn't the one-on-one Facebook conversation, but it was the spectators. I very rarely post anti-Christian stuff anymore. It kind of one of the things I've found with people who deconvert is they go through like 6 months to a year of like disenchantment, lostness, or some of them, and anger. And I was definitely like the anger, because I was like, I believe this thing that I now think is a lie, and I wasted all my time and energy and threw away a career in the concert industry to become a pastor. And so like my response was like to lash out. And now I'm just like, I don't know. Like I don't have the time to interact anymore on Facebook. Like I do interact with Facebook, but that's not where I'm putting my energy. So I think there's that, where like the low hanging fruit are the people watching the volley. And that's where, so if I'm talking with a diehard Bigfoot person or someone who believes in ghosts, I have very little faith that I'm going to change their belief, at least on interaction one. But there might be some people who are on the fence who are like, oh, Nate makes a better point than the ghost believer or than the Bigfoot enthusiast.
Right. They're called the lurkers.
Yeah.
And you never know if they...
Yeah, you don't. I think as far as like willful delusion, I don't think most people are willful anything. And I think this is where I'm still more Calvinist than you, in both the way I read the Bible and my belief about free will. I don't think free will is a thing. I'm really convinced that it's not. So for me to be willfully delusional, you need some level of free will. You need some level to be able to control your beliefs. And I think that's not how any of it works. I think beliefs are thrust upon you. There's no way you can actually control them. The way you form a belief is so shaped by outside influences, like you can't help but have it.
Yeah.
So to be willfully delusional, like implies some power that you have that I completely disagree with. And empirically, the data is on my side, which also makes for like our last few podcasts about conversion and deconversion, like, it actually might even be a more Calvinist reason of the Bible, where like you can't just decide to believe in Jesus. The Holy Spirit has to open your heart, and like God has to do some work inside of you. Yeah. Right. Like the Calvinists would say you have no choice in the matter whatsoever. Right. And through their reading of Scripture, they'd say like God calls those who are predestined to Him, and those people have no ability to say I'm not predestined, and the people who are not predestined for heaven have no ability to say, wait, I want to get in, right? Because their hearts are darkened and Satan has deceived them and they're wicked and they're not even searching for God, even though Romans 1 says they, like, it gets a little convoluted of like, do they know that there's a God? Do they not? Like, how are they deceived? But at the end of the day, the Calvinist, the Reformed person would say you don't have free will, right? God's going to save you whether you want to be saved or not, or He's not going to save you whether you want to be saved or not.
Except I don't know how far, so sorry to interrupt. I don't know how far they would go with philosophical, like overall philosophical determinism. I don't think they think that far out a lot of times, but definitely pertaining to how an individual is saved. So Calvinism is determinism.
Right, but you have to, if you're going to say how an individual is saved, you have to go...
Yeah, logically.
Yes, logically you do, right? Because, person A got saved because person B preached the gospel, how person... Like, the whole chain of events that led you to the moment where the Holy Spirit opened your heart for you to believe had to have happened. I guess we could imagine a universe where a different string of events happened. Mm-hmm. I think you have to be deterministic if you're a Calvinist. And I think I'm deterministic as not a Calvinist in some ways. We talked about sort of quantum mechanics in the multiverse where I'm not deterministic. But as far as human psychology and what you believe, like I don't believe you have any control over it whatsoever. So to be willfully delusional is a contradiction in my world. Mm-hmm. I also think most people, like, two things about most people. I think most people don't think very hard about what they believe. They just do it, right? So people who believe in fairies aren't necessarily taking a skeptical view of whether fairies exist, looking at the evidence. What they're doing is they're finding evidence that supports their claims, they're taking that in, and subconsciously they're throwing away evidence that doesn't support their claims. So they're not very skeptical about their beliefs. And I think though, people also want to believe what's true. And I think there's some evolutionary backing for that, because if you believe that the lion's in the forest and the lion is in the forest and you get away, like, you believed what was true and you were saved. And if you believe that the water is safe to drink and it is safe to drink, great. If you believe,
Yeah.
So I think very few people are like, well, here's all this evidence presented to me, and I'm convinced that the evidence is true, but I'm going to believe the opposite anyway. Right? So that's where I would think willful comes in, where, like, here is, we've searched the entire Loch Ness, right? If we could. Say we put cameras on every depth and we went from the north end to the south end and we found zero monster. I think most people would say, okay, we've searched it enough. They're like, we've looked at every square inch of Loch Ness at the same time, we found no monster. I think the vast majority of people who even believed in the Loch Ness monster would be like, okay, like, it's not there. Mm-hmm. They might change their story, like, it used to be there and then it died. There would be a few people who were like, well, the camera messed up, or, the Loch Ness monster can't be captured on visible spectrum. It can only be captured in like, there would be that small minority, but I think most people, for the most part, would say, okay, I did believe this thing that isn't true. And now it's been shown that it's not true, so I will change my beliefs.
Mm. Okay. So people
that was a big sigh.
they're not willfully deluded, and also they're not going to change their mind. And so, getting back to the utility or the ethics or the morality of conversation and persuasion, evangelism. I think that one of the things that I was thinking about when you were saying this was, I don't know if it's a response or a rebuttal in any way. I was just thinking how fascinating it is that your determinism. And in the introduction of our podcast, we always say, this is a podcast where a Christian pastor and a former evangelical net turned atheist have discussions about yada yada yada. I feel like after this conversation, it could be also the introduction could be, this is a podcast where a determinist and an existentialist have conversations about life and religion and philosophy and things. But I think I don't know how much I want to get into the weeds here. I think that I don't know, and I don't know that I don't know, and I don't know that I care if free will is real or an illusion. What I see is that if it is an illusion, it's a very powerful one. That the words that are about to come out of my mouth, even now, feel as if I'm making a choice against other choices that I could make. I could say something different. There's a world in which I could say something different, but I'm eliminating all of those things. And so it's not any less nihilistic. Mm-hmm. It's not any less bound in a way than your worldview, what I'm saying. The sort of existentialism viewpoint. Like, if I'm saying for myself, all there is the choice. And even if I, like the Rush song, even if I don't choose, I still made a choice.
Yeah.
The inescapable fact that, like, the foot goes forward or the mouth keeps speaking or the eye, it's just, you're never not in a moment making choices. That's the interesting thing to me, is that if I can't change somebody's mind, then what am I conversing for? And I feel like the thing that I was talking about before, I have to think that there might be poor people out there wondering, thinking, wait, am I the guy Matt's just arguing with in order for the lurkers? So, like, is Matt totally using me? And I feel like no one's going to debate me online anymore. They're like, I don't want to be Matt's tool.
So I guess when I'm saying, when I say determinism and free will, I much more mean it, not necessarily in like you chose to use, the term magenta instead of purpley red. But I think there's been a lot of experimental data to show like people don't believe the way that free will would say we do. They don't behave the way they think. Like people think they have free will. When you look at social behavioral psychology and experiments performed, they don't. Right? And so the addict is a great example here. As long as we're taking the secular worldview that it's not a moral failing. And I think a lot of religious people would say it's not a moral failing, but there is some people that say, no, it's a sin, like it's a moral failing.
Yeah.
And, so if the addict wants to get sober, wants to stop using heroin, and yet can't, like, that's not free will.
Yeah.
Right? Because their will would say, I want to not do this.
Right.
If there's a reason why Facebook is addicting and your apps are addicting and like the dings and the notifications and all, like people have spent billions of dollars figuring out how to tweak your psychology so when your phone makes a certain noise, you look. Mm-hmm. Right? You're not making a choice to look. It's Pavlovian. Mm-hmm. Right? The bell rings and you start salivating. Like that's not a free will thing anymore. Now, I don't know if it's necessarily deterministic in that everything is from here on out. If we were to know the position of every particle can be predicted.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's not free will.
So that kind of determinism is different than what I think Calvinism.
Yeah, in some
perceives
ways. It's not classical determinism. It's like because Newtonian, if you don't even need to be Calvinist, you just need to be Newtonian.
Right. To
say if I knew that position of every particle and the momentum of every particle, I can predict with, infinite precision where something will be in the future.
Right.
And since we're just made of particles, you could predict everything. Like quantum mechanics kind of throws that out. But psychology throws it back in. It says so I guess to go back to your question, why debate people? Why even hope for the lurkers? So it turns out that like conversation one might not change your mind, but it can start laying a groundwork for your mind to be changed, but it's not because of your will that it's going to happen.
Okay.
You're going to just wake up one day and have a different opinion, and there's going to be no connection that you could potentially make from A to B, but all of a sudden you're at B.
I believe that. I would probably put it in my own sort of Matt way, which I will do now. Just to affirm what you said, I think that everything that we say and do has an impact on other psyches as well as our own, and which then have impacts on other things that go on in the universe. It's quite incredible when you actually sit down to think about it. And it makes you want to not say anything. But even that has an impact.
Right.
So people, back in the day, there were actual hermits. Well, people are fascinated by hermits, so that has an impact. They're like, wait, that guy lives in a cave, he doesn't talk all day long. What does he do? What does he... You have that old movie where the guy's on the tower and forget what it's called, but he gains a big crowd by saying nothing, as much as any rhetorician, just because there are people fascinated by that lifestyle choice. So all the things that we do and all the things that we say, they have great impact. And I think you're right. I think people I think they realize after the fact, and more often than not, they can't connect it to anything in particular that someone has said,
right,
or read, every once in a while you might have something like, oh, I had this light bulb moment, or I had this paradigm shift when you said this. But I think people are infinitely egoistic and desire to attribute their life changes and the changing of their mind to some choice that they made. But actually the web of interdependence that we live in is you could call it determinism, but I recognize that the web of interdependence that we live in is incredibly complex to the point where if you imagine that you have completely free will without qualification. So I don't think this is a binary. I don't think when we're talking about free will versus determinism that there's no in between. Actually, I think there's a vast, maybe infinite in between. I would never argue for actual completely free will. I think it's easy to demonstrate, as you aptly did, that will is limited by so many things, not least of which, as I've just said, will is also eliminated by this deep interconnectedness. But it's still the moment of decision. If it's predetermined, you would never recognize it anyway.
Right. Yeah, and I think I take a probably stauncher black and white view. I think you're comfortable being in this middle of grayness of determinism, where versus free will, where if you grew up in poverty, you probably have some different views on this, or where I'm like, no, it's probably much more deterministic than I even want to admit. And by that, again, I don't mean that we can predict with accuracy what any individual action is going to be, but we can determine with pretty consistent accuracy what any group of people will do. Again, which is why app developers spend millions of dollars figuring out which chime is going to, right? They're doing that. And there may be an individual who doesn't respond to the same text sound as the vast, but if 1 million people do and one person doesn't, then empirically we're it's 1 in 1 million is a statistical anomaly. We can call it 0. Everyone responds to this text sound.
Right.
Yeah, I had something else too. Oh, so the only time I've actually seen willful, what was the phrase?
Willful delusion.
Willful delusion was when I was deconverting, asking people who were close to me to read some of the books I read, and them saying, no, I don't want to know that information because it might change my view as well. So that's the only time I've actually experienced willful delusion. Now, I do think this happens in most of the monotheistic, or all the monotheistic religions, and that they're taught. My seminary taught me, don't read these books. And I think, if you watch Islamic apologists on YouTube or wherever you watch your Islamic apologists, they are very clear, stay away from this. This is deception. Don't read these things. Don't listen to this argument. So there is some willful delusion there. But I think that's a special case.
It's interesting that you think it's special, and I may be deluded in my own little self-contained world, but I feel like I've had more than one experience with that from what I call the right side of evangelicalism, from fundamentalism. I remember I have a friend, shout out to Clark. Doubt he's listening. One of the smartest people I've ever met. Haven't talked to him in years and years and years, but we went to the same Bible college together. I think he's now a Hegelian professor. I think he teaches specifically Hegel, out in the Midwest somewhere, maybe Wisconsin. But always super skeptical and a questioner. And he wrote a paper in Bible college. The assignment was pick somebody you think was a super influential theologian in the 19th or 20th century and do a paper on. So he picked Karl Bart, who it's it's indisputable, whether you agree with his theology or not. The assignment was pick a theologian in the 19th or 20th century who's been majorly influential. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody more influential in the 20th century than Karl Barth. I mean, he's at the top 5 theologians. And so he did his paper on Karl Barth and was given an A-. Said it was, well-written, well-researched, well done. The problem with this paper is that Karl Barth is a heretic.
Yeah, I think I've told that story. A variation of it on this podcast.
So you had like the same sort of like...
Oh, remember I talked about the professor I wrote the Good Death Occur Before the Fall, and I got an A- because it's the same thing. Well written, presented. Yeah,
but that wasn't like mentioned as one of the criteria.
Right.
It wasn't like pick a person that we agree with.
Right.
Essentially pick a fundamentalist Christian. That was revealed after the fact.
Right.
Or and I remember I had a professor in Bible college once give the following illustration, which is really crude, not to mention like diametrically opposed to everything I believe, and I think you do too. He said you don't have to know the full extent of a turd to know that it's crap. It's just like the illustration there. What he's saying is like, bad theology is bad theology. I don't need to understand it. I don't need to know the inner workings of it. I don't need to research anything that I don't, because I already, like he's brazenly saying, maybe not brazenly, but brazenly implying that because he already knows all the truth, because he has the full counsel of God from Genesis to Revelation, because he has that, and he knows it and he's studied it. He actually, that's the thing that he can use to compare to any other information that he has. And so his worldview is impenetrable.
Yes.
It's impenetrable. And that's the point.
Yeah, I mean, so on the like beliefs and stuff, one of the other things I thought of was my deconversion. Like, I fully left the faith after watching Bill Nye debate Ken Ham. I was not a young earth creationist. I had no doubt that Bill Nye was going to win the debate against the young earth creationist. And by the end of that debate, I was no longer a Christian. When they asked the last question was to both panelists was, what would make you change your mind? And Bill Nye said evidence, and Ken Ham said nothing. Mm-hmm. So like,
why are we even debating?
Right. What's the point? And I think Ken Ham would say the point is that it's for the lurkers, and in his perspective, it's to find those lurkers that God has. I don't think he's reformed, but it's to get those lurkers who the Holy Spirit's going to open their heart and they're going to become Christians. And probably for Bill Nye, it's to prove that young Earth creationist is silly and wrong, because he thinks it's dangerous, and I would agree that that's one of the beliefs that is dangerous. But at the end of the day, like, why are they debating?
Yeah. And that's the interesting dynamic, is like, if you believe that the thing that they're debating, being on the wrong side of it, in other words, if young Earth creationism is untruth, and is not only untruth, maybe it's dangerous untruth. But I think we have a guest.
Hang on 1 second. So we just had a knock on the door, and I paused the recording. It turned out it was just FedEx delivering Ubi on-the-go bag refills, which is just for your diaper bag. So if you guys heard the knock, that's what we got. Super exciting. And if you didn't hear the knock, know that we paused the podcast to go open the door for FedEx, and I now have trash bags in my hand. Great.
I'm happy for you. And I'm happy that this is part of our podcast. So let me talk myself into what we were talking about, as awkward as it's going to sound for the episode. We were talking about the Ken Ham versus Bill Nye debates. Yeah. And the impenetrability of... Were you actually talking? No, I was talking.
Yeah.
And,
if you think creationism is harmful.
Yeah, if you think
creation.
if you think that creationism untrue and is therefore harmful, then it would seem like it is morally incumbent upon you to try and release that person. But then if they're not going to be released, as we've already discussed round and round at this point, then maybe some of their followers can, and that's the reason to debate them. And I find that pretty compelling, actually. But another question that gets brought up in all of that is the untruth, the fact that there's untruth in the world, allowed to, speak, allowed to have influence, allowed to be and exist, is the untruth itself harmful?
Right. Yeah, and so that's where I would say probably almost all the time, yes. But then we go back to the drug addict who got sober because of their belief in fairies. And, is it better to just let them believe in fairies if they're not harming anybody else?
And around we go. And this is why I think that of truth as I'm going to get in trouble with this in some circles. We don't, just like I say, we don't really know what we're talking about when we're talking about God. What in the world? Philosophy is, in some sense, a discussion of the truth. So if it is a millennia old discussion, we're talking about truth for more than 2,000 years. Since the Greeks, we've been talking about it in this super formal way that we talk about it. And we keep learning more and more about the nature of reality and more about the nature of things. We don't know the end. And if we don't know the end, how do we know what is capital T true? And if that's true, then what are we doing when we're debating? And what are we saying when we say something's untruth and that it's harmful? And
yeah, I guess sort of what I hear is the rabbit trail. Not that we're going on a rabbit trail of a Boltzmann brain.
Yeah.
Right. So at the end of the day, you can't prove that you're not a brain in a vat. Right. But that being said, there's still some usefulness in assuming you're not and that the external world is real. And you can glean, it's true that if you were to jump off a cliff with no parachute and just in what you're wearing now, you're going to fall towards the earth, and the earth is going to fall towards you, and it's not going to work out well for you, depending on how high the cliff is.
But let me bring up somebody I think that we both admire, David Hume, whose response to that would basically be to put it in, to almost bastardize what he was saying, but to put it in simpler terms, you never know. One time, all it takes is one time for gravity to not work. So when you say that gravity is true and real, you're not making an absolute metaphysical claim. You're making a claim about mathematical probability.
I mean, so this is where I think sometimes philosophers are just bullshit.
Yeah.
Is sure, construct whatever thought experiment you want, but if it doesn't, which is why I get upset with Tristan sometimes when we talk.
Hi,
hey,
Tristan.
Right? So we're talking on this Facebook thread about Aquinas and the cosmological arguments. Mm-hmm. And my whole premise is, or one of my premises is that if you have an infinite train, there is no engine, right? And everyone who wants to argue for the cosmological arguments is there has to be an engine. And I'm like, no, there actually doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. And the philosopher is like, no, there must be if we can construct a thought experiment where one time gravity doesn't work, then our knowledge of the universe is so incomplete to be meaningless, right? Where we have, and I guess potentially you could say one time it doesn't work, but there's so much evidence that it does. And the more we learn about it, the more we find out that all this evidence points to gravity is always going to work.
Well, let me put it then in in mathematical terms, because I wasn't trying to prove the existence of my own truth claims. Only just this. I'm not even sure what you call the point, but but if something has the chance, if something has a 1 in trillionth to the trillionth exponent
Sure.
of existing, then it's totally reasonable to say it's impossible.
Yes.
That's actually what we mean when we say something's impossible. We don't mean it in any absolute sense. We mean it
I don't know. The physicists
in a
would
mathematical
say,
sense.
The physicists would say there isn't a trillion to the trillion to the trillionth probability that something could go faster than the speed of light. There is zero, like mathematically zero chance that anything can go faster than the speed of light. Right? That is like a given to the universe. And if that is not true, then everything we know about the universe falls apart. Right? So they would say that is, and potentially that's a faith claim, though there's like math behind it and experiments.
Yeah. I wouldn't claim that it's a faith claim. I would say that it's a claim based on the best data available.
So
what I'm saying is that the term available is a relative term.
Yeah, but I think it goes beyond that in that initially it was data that showed that this is the speed of light.
Yeah.
And then it turns out if nothing can go faster than the speed of light, there are some predictions that follow. Right? And I think this is where this is where the empirical view I think has strength, because you're like, here are some predictions. If this is true, if A then B, let's go find B. Oh, we found B over and over and over again. Not only B, but if A then C, if A then D, right? And so now we have a theory that says nothing can go faster than the speed of light. This is how gravity works. Go test it, and if these claims are true, this is what you will find. And we find it over and over and over again. So at some point you have to say that's true.
Yeah, you say it's true.
Yeah, I guess I'm almost convincing myself right now that I'm wrong, because Newton makes claims and we can look at his data. But his data breaks down at some point.
What I'm saying is semantics. That's not what Ken Ham is saying. That's not what conservative Christianity is saying when they're saying is something is true. They're not saying that we've done the research, we've gathered the evidence, we've gathered the data, and the probability that God doesn't exist is so low that it must amount to zero.
Right.
No, they're saying God exists absolutely. That's the starting point.
Yeah.
That's a different way of... That's a different definition of the word in question. And the word in question is the word truth.
Right. Yeah.
It's a categorical difference. That's my point.
Okay. I don't know how we got there. Yeah, I agree, right? So, which goes back to sort of fairies. If someone's like, fairies exist, that's my starting point.
Yeah.
You're never going to convince them that fairies... Or you're never going to logically convince them that fairies don't exist. They might someday come to a conclusion that fairies don't exist, but it's going to be... If you laid seeds, they're not going to be able to point to a specific conversation. Someday they'll just wake up and be like, oh my gosh, fairies don't exist.
Right. In other words, my operating system, I realize, it doesn't work, doesn't exist, isn't true. This other operating system that I've heard tell, I've been lurking on the internet.
Right.
And I heard this about this other operating system. I don't know how I got there. I couldn't retrace my steps back and figure out exactly where the moment was that I deconverted, if there was a moment at all. But I'm embracing this new operating system. I'm embracing this new category.
Yeah.
And so that's why I feel like Tristan and I, hi Tristan, are, sometimes I feel like we're at an impasse, because it seems to me, and I'm sorry if I'm projecting something that's false, it seems to me that the impasse is between he and I, that faith is, for me, faith is ultimately faith. Mm-hmm. And it's absolute. There's no such thing as relative faith. And when you argue for pure objectivity, and that objectivity must be the standard by which all truth is measured, then you have to posit an absolute. And you have to posit something that there can never, ever, ever be the kind of evidence that the empiricist is demanding. And so there's no conversation. It's a categorical difference. And so you can say that, to me, apologetics is saying, look how well my confined, predetermined operating system works coherently. And the outsider can say, I don't agree with you, but I'm going to press you to make your system more and more coherent. But if it's an enclosed system, and it can't expand, and it can't shift, and it can't change, it can be logically coherent, rationally compelling, aesthetically beautiful, all of those things, and yet so hermetically sealed that it can never actually be conversed with.
Yeah.
Right? So you're just spinning your wheels having these conversations, hoping that one of those times the egg is broken and it's like, okay, I'm accepting a new seal.
Right.
I'm not doing this. I'm getting a new thing, and it's not a hermetically sealed thing. It's actually an entire interconnected, mysterious world of, and they call that nihilism, but to me, nihilism is like this thing that may absolutely be untrue, but I'm going to hold to it as absolute truth.
Yeah. Nothing better for a podcast than radio silence.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's partially why I do engage Tristan. I like Tristan a lot, and we're hopefully going to have him on as a guest, but I think that's partially why when we start getting into debates and there's an appeal to church authority, I'm just like, well, I'm out. Like, there's nowhere I can go here.
Right.
Because, like, that's it. Like,
right.
Like, you put up the final seal.
And when I'm saying,
and you're gonna completely disagree with us, Tristan. Yeah. We'll have a back and forth, but
and what I'm saying is, when I go out there and do Christian evangelism, trying to convince someone, which isn't even the way that I look at it. I look at it more of as like delivering a message, delivering the good news, evangelion. I don't look at it as I actually, to be completely fair, apologetics plays little to no part in me talking about the gospel. I'm not actually that interested in convincing and persuading anybody that it has any logical coherence. What I'm saying is, here's a historical claim about an empty tomb and about a claim made by a man to be God. And if it's true, what does that mean for our lives personally? But you're believing it, and I think that's something that I admit, right? Mm-hmm. Admit that's what I'm doing. I'm believing it because I choose to.
Or you don't.
Don't.
You don't choose it. Yeah, I don't know how we wrap up this episode. There was like 20 different rabbit trails we went on and tangents that we could have explored. I guess just to, just like I have problems with like philosophy in some ways and church tradition in others, and like you said, like this hermetically sealed. I think that it's not just Christianity, like the belief in fairies. Mm-hmm. You can always ask the person who believes in fairies, like, well, show me one. Well, I can't. Why? Well, because when you get close, why can't you ever get to the other side of the rainbow where the leprechaun's gold is? Because the rainbow keeps moving, right? And I kind of feel like supernaturalists, like, that's the play. It's just like move the goalpost. Like the pot of gold keeps going. And it's not necessarily a god of the gaps, but it is like there's always an explanation for why it can't be empirically shown.
It's either that, or I feel like there's a misdirection in terms of they play the burden of proof game.
Yeah, I mean, that's... Yeah.
Which happens with...
I don't have to prove that no God exists.
Well, yeah, but...
I don't, right? Like, just like I don't have to prove that unicorns don't exist. If you're making the claim that Sasquatch or unicorns or fairies exist, like, you need to prove it to me.
Yeah, but it's also not a courtroom. So, it's that's why I say it's a red herring. Ultimately, it's maybe a logical fallacy in terms of jurisprudence, but it's also just a red herring. And it's not just between Christian and atheists. I noticed this in debate, no matter what the topic is, whether it be politics or sociology, whatever. Like low level Facebook debating is people constantly shifting the burden of proof.
Yeah, it's all whataboutism.
That's all it is. Whataboutism, exactly. That's
which is a little different than shifting the burden of proof, but yeah.
Yeah. And so people don't want, they don't want the burden of proof. This is just say, yeah, exactly. Whataboutism. Well, what about, so you have so you're an empiricist and you don't believe that, you don't believe in dogmatic, objective truth claims. Isn't that an objective, dogmatic truth claim?
Presuppositional apologetics are so painful. I used to use that as a Christian.
Yeah.
And it's so painful now.
Well, it's just like, no, I just believe what I believe based on what I know. That's it.
Based on deterministic influences outside of my control that began with the genetic composition as well as how I was. But all right, so end of the day, guy who believes in fairies is now sober, but for a fact fairies do not exist. Is it morally incumbent upon you to convince him of the capital T truth, or is it okay to let it lie?
I'm sorry, I derailed this into other things. I didn't derail us. It was relevant. But I just don't have time to answer that question. My actual answer to the question that I brought up is complex. I think it depends. Yeah. I think it depends on a lot of different factors. But I wouldn't say that it's absolutely incumbent upon you to try to dissuade him. I would say there are circumstances in which he's better off deluded.
So I almost agree, and I think the way I act day to day, I very much have that philosophy. Like I said, I'm not trying to deconvert people on the reg anymore. Like, I'm very content to sort of let people go to church. And, initially when I deconverted, I was like, I should stand outside of churches with pamphlets and like anti-tracts. And I didn't. And like from my day-to-day cycles, I kind of let people believe what they want. But I would say one of the reasons I would think it is detrimental is because that guy now believes that he got sober because of fairies that don't exist instead of the strength that he was able to muster inside. And so at the end of the day, I think what all religions do, and all supernaturalism in some sense do, is detract from the strength that humans have. Right? So like attributing the Egyptian pyramids to aliens is just saying like humans weren't smart enough then. And like it takes away their inherent value that they were so clever they figured out how to stack these rocks so high that until the Eiffel Tower was built, they were the largest, tallest structure in the world. I mean, we're talking 5,000 years, right? So I think all of it, like if fairies got the guy sober instead of him figuring out how to do it, like it takes something away of humanity for me. Which maybe is why I find atheism beautiful.
Yeah, but I think it's fair to ask, why is that important to you? Why is giving credit to the human rather than to the supernatural being? Why is that a value that you have? I don't think it's obvious.
Huh?
I don't think it's an obvious answer.
Yeah, I
I don't
don't.
think it's self-evident that we should
I mean,
be
maybe.
humanists.
Why not? With the 5 remaining minutes. I mean, clearly, we wouldn't be having these conversations every week if you thought it.
Yeah. I guess I would value humanism if I was an empiricist and a determinist, such as yourself. Because what else? At the end of all that, you go, well, then the value of life is like making it better for human beings.
Yeah.
But it seems like you're almost positing it not only as an end, but also as a sort of starting point as well. And that's what I'm asking, is like it's not self-evident that humanism is good. It comes at the end of other philosophical decisions that you made before you got to that.
It's probably fodder for another episode.
Yeah, I think so.
So you want to let people live in delusion, potentially.
Not absolutely.
Potentially, for some people in certain circumstances, letting them live in their delusion is a better place for them to be than trying to rip them into what you feel is a better reality.
Potentially.
Yes. And I am on the other side of that. For the most part.
And yet you recognize that there might be a lack of utility in trying to persuade certain people.
Yeah, I mean...
It might not be worth your time and effort.
Yeah, and I think that's true of everything, not just...
Yeah.
Like, I work in kitchens, and I remember working with people who, like, their job is food. And I'm like, you should try this new food you've never tried. And like, oh no, I don't eat that. I'm like, how do you work in food and not want to try what this is?
Yeah.
Right? And
that's
like,
a good illustration.
At the end of the day, like, there's no convincing them that they should try sweetbreads. And I'm like, this is delicious. They're like, well, I've never had it before.
You just framed it completely different. You just framed it in a way that, like, I think is accessible to most people. It's like, I have a way of living in the world that's awesome, and you're missing out.
Yeah.
You should try it. Just try it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you have to. You might not like it, but at least try it.
Yeah.
And I have a friend one time to whom I said, "This is a good place to stop." So we'll stop at like a Coen's brother movie, just like on the what was that about? To whom I said, "Don't knock it till you try it." You know that cliche.
Yeah.
I think we were talking about ice cream flavors. So we were talking about like bacon on ice cream or something. So don't knock it till you try it. And he said to me, "Well, I've never tried suicide."
Have a great week.